Hey YouTube. I really want to tell you about my favorite magic book. But what's odd is that it isn't my favorite magic book because of all the juicy secrets on its pages. Rather, it's the story of its author, the effect that this book had on the world of magic, and the friend who helped me to appreciate all of that make this book my absolute favorite. And that storied tome is Professor Hoffman's Modern Magic. It was originally printed back in 1876, which makes this book very old. Well, not this book. This is just a janky paperback copy I picked up from a friend when I started to give a damn about history. This edition, however, was originally printed back in 1882. It's the original US edition, and by the time this edition had been printed, Modern Magic as a book had already been out for a solid 6 years, and had done something that wouldn't be recognized until several decades later. It divided the history of magic into two eras. The era before Professor Hoffman showed up, and the era after. Professor Hoffman wasn't born Hoffman. He was originally born Angelo John Lewis in 1839 in London, England, which meant that he was steeped in the Victorian era of magic when he was coming up in the world. But that's also a really difficult time to try to become a magician, largely because of the lack of practical literature on how to do so. There were still magic books being written back then, but they were largely from a theoretical perspective, more 10,000-foot view, less explanation. So they had sentences like, one steps to the end of the stage displaying the hand as if full whilst unsuspiciously removing the coin without view of the audience. No help, no pictures, good luck bro. And with vague explanations like that, somehow Victorian-era magic literature helps Angelo John Lewis to eventually become the thriving Professor Hoffman. But in his early 30s, he starts to make things better. So in 1872, he begins releasing articles for a British periodical called Young Gentleman's Magazine about how to be a magician, with one very important difference. He actually explained how to be a magician. He wanted the people reading the articles to be able to execute the effects from beginning to end and leaving no guesswork. There were even pictures! And this was a game changer. 4 years later, in 1876, all of the articles are eventually compiled into a single volume called Modern Magic. And this is what kicks off the renaissance of magic during that era. But to his contemporaries, this was the beginning of the end. Now, I could tell you this next part because it's juicy, but the truth is you should probably hear it from the man who helped me give a damn, not just about Professor Hoffman, but the entire era that modern magic ended up kicking off. His name is Dr. Will Houstoun, and he is the only person walking the planet with a doctorate in magic history. They actually had to invent the program for him. Not only that, but his thesis was on Professor Hoffman and the books that he wrote. So, without any further ado, allow me to introduce Dr. Will Houstoun. Will! Hey, buddy.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm doing well. Let's see. The last time that you and I were in front of each other was Blackpool.
It was Blackpool. It was pretty much the last time I got to leave the house before all this lockdown stuff started up.
Before the world lit on fire.
Magicians in one big room.
This is kind of interesting because you got a PhD in history and specifically the history of magic, but that wasn't your initial area of study. You were engineering initially, yeah?
Yeah, very, very much a sort of sharp U-turn, I suppose. So I did a master's degree in mechanical engineering to start with at Nottingham University. I very much felt like the right thing to do, if not the most interesting thing as I was doing it. But magic kind of ran along as a hobby, I suppose, whilst that was happening. And after finishing up on the master's course, I did a couple of magic competitions, the European Championships, the Circle competition, a couple of other bits and pieces. I spent some time doing shows in Spain, some time doing lectures in America, and a little bit of time writing a book about late 18th century card tricks. And all of that, frankly, felt more fun than engineering was. So I sort of got stuck into a few gap years, then found out that maybe you could do this magic stuff in an academic context. That seemed like too good an idea to drop. So I did some sort of looking around and eventually found a way to make that work.
What was it about Hoffman that made you stick with him? Why was it that you looked at him and thought, this is the keystone for an entire generation of magic?
That really is the thing that made me stick with Hoffman, is you look at all of these other people, they're super interesting, they did cool things, they knew exciting people who I want to know more about. Hoffman is very much somebody who you sort of have a before Hoffman and an after Hoffman era. And the publication of Modern Magic represents really a point when everything shifts, A, within the public's perception of magic, and B, within magicians' perception of magic. So Hoffman wrote Modern Magic, his first book. It was serialized to start with. Then it was sold in a bound edition starting in 1876. And it was fantastically popular. The first edition sold out in 7 weeks. And then there are 20 or so editions over the course of the next 30 years, each several thousand copies. And the thing which Hoffman did, which made his book more popular, was that he really taught people how to do magic. So in his introduction, he says there's a big difference between telling somebody how a trick is done and teaching them how they can do it themselves. Most books pre-Hoffman just tell you, hide the coin in your hand to make it disappear, which is kind of fine, but doesn't really tell you how to make a coin disappear. Hoffman goes into all of the nuts and bolts. How do you behave? How do you act? What do you say? How do you stand? How do you manipulate the coin? All of the things that you need to know if you're actually going to stand in front of people and seem to make a coin disappear. So Hoffman's big shift was that he said it's good for you to learn practically how to do it rather than just having a kind of theoretical knowledge of how it's done. The other thing he did, which again, I think is a huge part of the reason for the success of his stuff, is that he said this is something useful that young people should learn. And young people in the Victorian period should learn this, not because they're all going to become professional magicians. It'd be an awful world, I think, if everyone became a professional magician, but because magic would teach them useful things. It would teach them how to perform. It would teach them how to present information to people. It would teach them how to problem solve, how to deceive, how to spot deception. And all of these different skills would be things that would be useful in the furtherance of the British Empire's goals and in the furtherance of people's professional lives. So Hoffman made these two real big shifts. One of them to say, learn how to do it practically so you can stand in front of your friends and family and do a magic trick for them. The other one to say the reason you're learning this is because it's a way of bettering yourself. It's a way of serving the British Empire. It's a way of doing all of these things, which are hugely, hugely important in the Victorian period. That makes the book take off. It becomes hugely popular. And because it's the book which takes off, that then has all of this ripple impact, which you can feel, I think, all the way to the present day.
When Hoffman released his book, one of the major things that came out was that he was an exposer, that he was destroying the art form, and that it would have been better if all of the copies were burned and that he were to die in his mother's womb. So can you tell me a bit about that, about how that has transitioned over the course of time, about how magic is not only shared with the world, but how it's taught in context?
Sure. So I think it's a really interesting one because you do have that sort of slowly shifting perspective. You do, as you said, literally get people saying, I wish he died in his mother's womb. Stanley Collins describes him as the arch exposer and almost refuses to say Professor Hoffman, even though Collins does decide to buy Hoffman's library at one point for his collection. You also have, I think it was a dean of the Society of American Magicians, who said the whole thing's a disaster. The world will be as full of magicians as the New Jersey coast is of mosquitoes. So there were lots of people really a little bit peeved about this whole thing of explaining magic tricks to the public. Hoffman very much, I think, felt that he was in the right with all this stuff. He made a point of saying that he was only exposing tricks which he had been given permission to expose, or which he felt were sort of suitably within the public domain, that they were fair game. And you can see things that back that up. I've tracked down 11 of his personal notebooks so far. There's a couple that I haven't found yet, but I've managed to track down most of them. And inside those, there are lots of things that he gets told, which he's marked with a little P for private. And those are things that just don't appear in his books. It's only the things which have either had the private crossed out or which haven't got that marking, which find their way into the books. So Hoffman very much felt he was doing the right thing. Magicians, a little bit peeved, some of them, didn't think he was doing the right thing. And I think the point where it branches out is where the benefits to magicians starts to become greater than the pain they're suffering. So you've got a generation who are annoyed by the whole thing because it's exposing tricks that they're doing in their shows and they feel that takes something away from them. You then get people like Maskelyne, who says that Hoffman's books are probably good because they force people to innovate and come up with brand new material, like the things that he's currently doing at Egyptian Hall. I suspect he doesn't really believe that, but he's just aware that that's a better PR angle to take to the whole thing, rather than just saying, no, it's awful, nobody should buy this book, because then everyone's going to buy the book and nobody's going to come to his shows. And then you get a generation of magicians whose introduction to magic comes from modern magic. So because Hoffman's book is so widely distributed, loads of people read it. Of course, the intent isn't that they all become amazing magicians, But if enough people bump into a book, some of them are probably going to become pretty good magicians at some point in their life. So you end up where you have a generation or two where you have people like David Devant, Howard Thurston, possibly Houdini. It's a little bit less clear. Certainly Keller, Alexander, the Man Who Knows, all people who say their introduction to magic comes from reading Professor Hoffman's book. And at that point, I suppose, he's almost becoming this kind of father figure, mentor type person who's introduced magic to all of these people who then go on to be its headliners, its celebrities, and have very happy careers because of it. So at that point, I think he really becomes accepted into the magic world. I think as the magic world tries to push for more and more social acceptability, the idea that you have this kind of grand old man of magic, as he was sometimes described, is a good thing. It sort of says this is part of a long-standing, honest, upstanding tradition. And I think he becomes beneficial to the magic world as that fatherly figure. So I think that's how the transition happens, probably.
That makes sense. Okay, so how would we relate this to the way it's being done in the modern era? Now we've got basically magic at your fingertips. I mean, you could basically get an entire education off your phone. And, we've got magazines, we've got books, we've got DVDs, we've got downloads, PDFs. Mm-hmm. How do you feel how it's done now relates to how it was done during that era?
So I guess a couple of things are interesting about it. One of them is the impact Hoffman's had in terms of legacy. The other is what you can say about exposure and stuff. In terms of the legacy side of things, I think the interesting thing is Hoffman's books are so formative to so many people and so recommended by so many people that they almost have a disproportionate impact on all the magic that follows. Jim Steinmeier has written about this very, very clearly, but a good example, I think, is the pass. So Hoffman writes about magic in a Victorian 1870s sort of a way and says the pass is the backbone of magic. That's the move you have to be able to do if you want to be a card magician. And that sort of becomes accepted, and it stays accepted all the way through till you start looking at texts like The Royal Road to Card Magic, which go out of their way to say this idea that you have to do a pass before you can do a card trick for somebody is really off-putting and not particularly helpful, and very much not the case. So maybe you can approach it in this other way instead. So I think an interesting aspect of Hoffman's legacy is his book is so good and so well regarded that people take things that perhaps were true in 1870 or 1860 when Hoffman learned them and then still believe them to be true in 1940. You also get all of the obvious things, I suppose, like Hoffman saying, make sure you don't wear the robes of a wizard, i.e. like a pointy hat and a big long flowing gown. Instead, you should be wearing evening wear, which is the only sort of thing suitable for a gentleman magician. People read that, they go, okay, I have to wear evening wear as well. And the thing that they've missed is Hoffman isn't saying you need to wear a dinner suit. He's saying that if you were part of smart society in 1870, you would wear a dinner suit and you should be dressed that way because that's the world you're trying to fit into. Yet you still get people in 2021 wearing dinner suits because they go, Hoffman says you've got to wear a dinner suit. That's what a magician's meant to be. And, I suspect he would be all for David Blaine wearing a very expensive and stylish leather jacket and T-shirt rather than wearing the tuxedo and all this stuff, which is now so incredibly dated. So I think that's one interesting sort of legacy from his stuff. The other side of the whole thing is the exposure stuff. And I think the exposure stuff is interesting for two reasons. The first is the stuff that you've already brought up with magicians saying modern magic is going to kill magic. It's the end, it's destroyed, it's over. No prizes for guessing at this point. It's very much not over. It carried on quite well, thank you very much. And in fact, probably got quite a lot better because of books like Hoffman's. You then see exactly the same thing happening each time people move into a new format or a new medium to try and explain stuff. So I just about remember VHS being something that would destroy magic. I certainly remember DVDs being something that would destroy magic. I certainly remember downloads being something that will destroy magic. And I certainly know now that YouTube is the thing which is about to destroy magic and it will never recover. It was nonsense in Hoffman's case with his book. It was nonsense with VHS. It's nonsense with DVDs. I suspect it's nonsense with downloads too. These are all things which will in the long term make magic better and make people able to access it better and able to learn it better. I think the big challenge, though, is that Hoffman's writing highlights the acceleration in pace. So even if you're conservative, and I know this is not technically correct, but if you go with sort of the standard version and you say The Discovery of Witchcraft is the first book explaining magic in the English language in 1584, you've then got quite a good chunk of time, about 300 years, before Hoffman writes a really good book that teaches people how to do magic. So you've got 300 years during which people are sort of figuring out bit by bit how they can explain magic well in the written word. And then since Hoffman, so many people have done it so well, including all the people around today, like Richard Kaufman, Stephen Minch, etc., etc. Within the world of people doing like YouTube tutorials, YouTube hasn't been around for more than a blink of the eye compared to the 300 years between discovery and modern magic. So I think the real thing is that people just haven't worked out yet how to teach magic in the most effective way via things like DVDs or downloads or YouTube tutorials. And the question isn't whether or not these things are going to destroy magic. The question is just how long will it take for magicians to work out how to teach magic using these different forms to the best potential to be able to have the largest impact. I'm pretty sure we're not there yet, because it would be incredible for us to get there in all of 10 minutes. But I'm pretty sure it will happen, and then there will be a new format in the future. And when that new format comes out, some people will say it will be the death of magic. And some people will realize in a few years later on, everything will probably be good and probably be better because of it.
Very good. Well, as ever, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And there you go. That's Will. And that is the story of how one man and one book printed back in the late 1800s kicked off a renaissance in magic and started a revolution that is still going to this day. If you guys want to learn more about Dr. Will Houstoun, the man is fascinating. So I got the chance last year to do a full-blown interview with him where we went over not just his academic work, but also his consulting, the virtual show that he developed during lockdown, as well as some of the programs that he's actively a part of that explore the combination of magic and medicine for therapy purposes. So if you want to watch that interview, I'll put a link in the description below. And in the meantime, I'll see you guys soon.